welcome to this Demos event in conversation with Sir John Curtice. My name's Polly Curtice. I'm the Chief Exec of the cross-party think tank Demos, and this is Sir John Curtice. Doesn't really need an introduction. Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde, the gold standard of polling, and I think definitely within our world, a bit of a national treasure.
That means you think I should be a museum piece, doesn't it?
Not at all. Well, you would not be here. So we've done these events for about 4 years with Sir John, and the purpose of them is to bring a bit of a reality check into the conference bubble, to bring the kind of thoughts, feelings, hopes, dreams of the nation into the conversation that we're all having around politics and policy through party conference season. We do them at Labour, at Conservatives, and at the Liberal Democrats as well. And I think it's worth starting with a bit of a trigger warning. This is not an easy session. And I want to promise you that it's as uneasy for all the political parties at the moment, and as fair and as rigorous and as evidence-based as you would expect from Sir John. The format is going to be a presentation for Sir John, where he's going to take us through Labour's first year and what's happened to the political fortunes and what's been moving the polls. We'll have a bit of a discussion between us afterwards, but then we'll open it out quite quickly to the floor, because there will be lots of questions that are really important in your minds. And I can see people in this room with so much expertise and interest in this area. So I'm keen to kind of get the conversation going in the room as soon as possible. So be thinking of questions. And with that, I'm going to hand over. Thank you.
Thank you, Polly. Thank you to Demos for holding the faith of these slightly less than cheerleading sessions. Thank you all for coming and thinking this was rather more interesting than was going on in the main hall. So we're grateful for you for coming. There's going to really be two halves to this. The first half I'm going to go through fairly quickly. It is, as it were, a section which is basically about, for those of you who've not been following the story so far, and I suspect most of you in this room have been following the story so far, that is, I want to look at where the general election left this party as of the 5th of July, because I don't think you can understand what's happened since the 5th of July last year unless you are au fait with where the party was at on the 5th of July. But I'm going to go through that quickly because quite a lot of it is familiar territory, and then I will go through a little more slowly in rather more detail about what has been happening to this party and the political firmament more broadly during the course of the last 15 months. So you'll be surprised to hear that the title is Labour's Challenge. So let's go back, as it were, to the beginning. This is what happened on the 4th of July. And to be honest, my wife is now getting more and more annoyed that every time I hear a journalist on the radio or television say, oh, but of course Labour won this enormous landslide, how could they possibly be in so much trouble? And I go, they didn't win by a landslide. And the crucial thing, two crucial facts you need to bear in mind. The first is at 35% of the vote, you secured the lowest share of the vote ever secured by a government with an overall majority. You managed to beat Tony Blair's 36% in 2005. And secondly, given the turnout of a little under 60%, that means that only just around 1 in 5 of the adults in this country voted Labour. So point one, that's the most obvious way in which the result on the 4th of July indicated the thinness of this party's support rather than a large degree of enthusiasm. The second thing I need to remind you of, and I know this is deeply uncomfortable for both Labour and Liberal Democrat activists, is that you have to thank Nigel Farage a great deal for the fact that you did get such a large majority, because it was Nigel Farage and Reform who by far and away won the battle for 2019 Conservative voters. Around 1 in 4 of those people who voted Conservative in 2019 switched to Reform. You picked up around 1 in 8, and Liberal Democrats even less than that. But it was the collapse of the Conservative vote primarily to Reform that meant that what was no more than a modest improvement in this party's support, albeit concentrated in marginal seats, was able to turn into so many seats. But one of the things you are discovering is that reform at 15% is good news for Labour, reform at 30% is bad news. The second thing one has to say is, of course, a lot of what Labour talked about when Sir Keir Starmer became leader was it needed to reconnect with voters who had voted Leave, and thereby also needed to reconnect with its traditional working class voters. Labour made very little progress in that supposed strategic objective. You just managed to win the election anyway. So here, for example, is the evidence on the relationship between vote and party support in 2024 and how it changes from 2019. And I'm using people's current preference at the time of the two elections, not how they voted in 2016. You will note that, yes, at the margin, Labour did manage to increase its support somewhat more amongst those people who voted Leave, who are in favour of being outside the European Union. But we may bear in mind that is a smaller group than it was back in 2019. But your support is still overwhelmingly on the Remain side of the argument. And yes, who is it that already at that stage was destroying the Johnsonian coalition of 2019? It was primarily Reform. What therefore then also follows is that it doesn't matter which source you use. There is absolutely no evidence out there to suggest that the Labour Party particularly reconnected with working class voters. Now, in the language of market researchers, which is one of the surveys I'm using here, C2, skilled working class, DE, broadly speaking, unskilled working class. As you can see, Labour's vote is basically more or less the same, irrespective of people's occupational position. That was also the position in 2019. Indeed, if anything, Labour's vote went up slightly more amongst those in professional and managerial AB occupations. You can talk about yourselves as being the party of working people, but I think most managing directors think they are working people. But it is no longer clear that this is a party of the working class. The party, and I know it's very uncomfortable for Labour politicians, but the party whose support, relatively speaking, is strongest amongst those in working class occupations was Reform last year, and that still continues to be the position now. The other thing you have to appreciate is that the ideological divide in our politics has become much more complicated. Traditionally, politics in the UK was an argument between economic left and economic right. It's the argument that this party is very comfortable having about. It's between those who think that inequality in this country is too great and the state should be doing something to try to reduce it, and those who say, no, actually what the state needs to be doing is creating the circumstances to deliver economic growth from which everybody then can profit. That's the traditional centre-right argument. And if you measured where people stand on that divide, historically, that was the big division that distinguished Conservatives from Labour. Yes, there was a second divide of social liberals versus social conservatives, folk who are relatively relaxed about immigration, feel that the state shouldn't be imposing its morality on people, relatively happy about having a diverse population, etc., versus social conservatives who say, no, we need a degree of cultural and social homogeneity in order to have the social cohesion that's crucial to keeping society together. There was a bit of that. The Liberal Democrats, the secret was in the name. Liberal Democrats tend to be social liberals. But particularly for this party, the social liberal, social conservative divide largely didn't matter. Those days are over. This is showing you the relationship between vote and where people stand on that, those two divisions. You can see on the left-hand side, yes, your support is much higher amongst people on the left than it is amongst the right. The opposite is true for the Conservatives. But notice that how do you define Reform supporters? You define Reform supporters by their social conservatism. That is what primarily defines them. Yes, but you are also now being defined by the fact that you are appealing primarily to social liberals. It follows from what I've shown you on Brexit. Brexit was not a divide between left and right. It was a divide between social liberals and social conservatives that accelerated the movement of that ideological division into our politics. And 2024 did not see it disappear. In fact, the Greens, again, also, they're all on the left, but they're also defined by being social liberals. So the point you realise is that because you can be a social conservative, you can be on the left, you can be a social liberal, and you can be on the right, there is now clearly ideologically space for more than two parties. And this is one of the reasons why we are now living in the more fragmented five-party world. The other thing one has to say, and this is where things get a bit personal, the honest truth is that Sir Keir Starmer was, except very early in his leadership when few people knew anything about him, has never been a popular leader. And for the most part, certainly from the spring of 2021 onwards, this is you guys' favourability ratings, he was always trailing his party in the favourability stakes. He is not somebody who has been particularly successful for a very long time at impressing himself on the British public. Indeed, if you actually compared using Ipsos's satisfaction data, on which, by the way, coming out over the weekend, Sir Keir is now the most unpopular Prime Minister in UK polling history. But even leaving that aside, as you can see, at the time of his election and comparing that with the position, and the run-up to election, comparing that with the equivalent figures for Blair and Cameron. Tony Blair had positive net satisfaction ratings in the run-up to 97. Even David Cameron was basically even Stevens. Keir Starmer was clearly in net dissatisfaction territory in the run-up to 2024. And finally, and not unrelated, even before the election, repeated measures, these are data from Ipsos, I'm going to show you the more recent data in a moment, the public were saying, what's this guy about? What does he stand for? What does the Labour Party stand for? And of course that slogan change told you, well, it wasn't the current lot, but of course there were lots of possible alternatives that you might be able to frame to what was then the incumbent government. Of course, then what's also true, and we do have to acknowledge straight away, this was a very, very tough gig to inherit. It wasn't like 1997, when basically we'd had record levels of stable economic growth, the best period of economic growth in Britain's post-war economic history. After we were forced out of the ERM mechanism in 1992, it destroyed the Tories politically, but it paved the way to our best period of economic growth, etc., etc. The gig now is very, very different. This is data on people's feelings about their household income, and you can see the impact of the so-called cost of living crisis. The blue line are those people who say they're living comfortably on their household income. The grey line, those who say they are struggling. And you can see the proportion of people who say they are comfortable has been declining, certainly during the last decade or so, and particularly including during the course of the pandemic. And those who say they are struggling has increased over the same period. The second thing is that, yeah, we were grumbling about the health service in the 1990s and about high levels of waiting lists. That was something that New Labour succeeded in turning around through a combination of funding and targets. Oh, and by the way, including increasing taxes, as Rachel Reeves did last autumn. But the pandemic, of course, we decided not to have a whole loads of elective surgery. That's left a legacy of really high waiting lists, and levels of satisfaction with the NHS are higher, way higher than they ever have, dissatisfaction higher than they ever have been ever since British Social Attitudes started covering this in 1983. And meanwhile also there has been some reaction, although it can be exaggerated, against the fact that during the course of the last 2 or 3 years, the UK has experienced both a record level of legal migration and also a record level of irregular migration. One of the paradoxes of the whole Brexit debate is that actually, even before the EU referendum, attitudes towards migrants, which were very critical, unsympathetic for much of the first decade of the 21st century, people were inclined to say migrants were bad for the country's economy, they undermined the country's culture. That was already beginning to disappear, and in the post-EU referendum environment, here's an example on the economic consequences, the public were inclined to feel that migrants were actually quite good for an economy. There has now been some reaction back, but actually attitudes towards migrants are still more favourable now than they were 20 years ago, when we last had a row about asylum seekers and New Labour had to deal with it. So the problem can be exaggerated. But, crucial thing therefore to take away, we're talking about a government that inherited a very, very difficult gig with very clear political weaknesses in terms of its leadership, in terms of its levels of support, and in terms of the fact that it hadn't reconnected with what it regarded as its traditional working class base, and in the past provided with a crucial demographic anchor, and in a political environment which is now ideologically much more complicated than this party has been used to. This party wants to talk about left versus right. I'm afraid the world is no longer simply about that. So a point therefore is we need to understand where we were at before Labour got elected. One other final point to make, there has also been serious decline in confidence in the ability of the British state to solve this country's problems. This is people's attitudes towards whether the system of governing Britain needs a great deal of improvement, or which is the orange line, or not very much, which is the blue line. As you can see, basically, ignoring the fine detail, over the longer run, people have become increasingly coming to the view that the way that this country is governed is in need of improvement. And there is a lack of trust and confidence in the British state, and also, frankly, in the ability of the two traditional governing parties, Conservative and Labour, to be able to deal with it. So it was a very difficult gig. What's happened since? Well, you're familiar with all of this. This is a running average, running monthly average of the opinion polls. Reform basically moved into the lead in the spring. They then got up to about 31% in the immediate wake of the county council elections at the beginning of May, and they have largely stayed there since. People talk about reform having momentum. Not clear. They've plateaued. It's just that they've plateaued ahead of everybody else. Of course, again, one should be clear. Historically, 31% has never, ever previously been a winning number. We should not exaggerate how popular reform are. Normally, these are the kinds of things that parties lose elections on. 31% is what the Tories got back in 1997 and lost by a country mile. But of course, in our fragmented politics, and given our electoral system, 30 or 31% could be enough. This party's support has just, this is the red line, has just gradually and persistently declined. There is no one clear event that is clearly associated with it. You can't blame it on the two-child decision, or on the winter fuel allowance, or on the autumn budget of last year, or anything else. Oh, and by the way, it's a bit of good news for the morning. Neither Rayner nor Mandelson has made any difference at all. The truth is, you're already so low. My view when I was being asked about Rayner's resignation, how much damage we'd Labour, I said probably zero, because its vote is already so low. So one advantage of being down in the polls is, you can have a few internal storms and it won't make much difference. So whether it reinforced voters' perceptions of this party is maybe another matter. The Conservatives, of course, despite being at an all-time record low all the way back, including 1832, now running at about 17%. Liberal Democrats, a little bit of progress, but not much. The Greens at 10% are now at an all-time high. They have finally broken through the 9% barrier that they achieved in the immediate wake of the 1989 European elections. And if you don't remember that, look it up on Wikipedia. Okay, so to that extent, at least, you're all aware of the problem that this party seemingly faces. One other thing you need to know, and again, there's a lot of kind of interest in these so-called multi-regression and post-stratification polls. I've now been through a couple of them. The crucial thing you get out of these polls, and those polls told us before the general election that the Conservative vote was going to fall more heavily in places where they were previously strongest. They told us that voters were going to vote tactically against the Conservatives for whichever opposition party was better placed to overtake them. They told us that Labour were going to do well in Scotland. So you can't ignore these things. The thing is, they give you an idea of where support's going up and where it's going down. Now, the crucial thing you need to realise, at 21%, you have lost 40% of the support that you had in 2024. That is almost in proportionate terms as big a drop as the Conservatives suffered last year. They lost about 45% of their 2019 vote. If you lose votes on that scale, you are almost arithmetically bound to lose support more heavily in the places where you were previously strongest. That is the crucial underlying message in the YouGov poll. As you can see here, your support is going down by 20. So across the country as a whole, down by 14 points, but down in places where you Reform is second, you're down by 20, where the Greens, you're down by 18, where you're fighting the SNP, you're down by 20, and where you're fighting against the Tories, you're down by 16. Your position is worse in the constituencies you are trying to defend. The same is there in the More in Common poll that came out yesterday, and I've done a quick calculation. Basically, this geographical variation means that you end up losing about 50 more seats than would be the case if your vote was simply going down by 14 points everywhere. So the geography that did so much damage to the Tories last year is now also potentially going to cause you difficulties. Oh, and by the way, I mean, the Conservatives are losing ground more heavily, still losing ground more heavily in places where they were previously strongest. So the national polls tell you a bad enough story. The geographical variation is probably even worse. That said, it is a mistake to believe that this party's only problem is reform. It isn't. Actually, you are losing more support to the Liberal Democrats and the Greens collectively, much more support than you are to reform. Yes, reform, and this is where understanding the politics and the strategy of first past the post in a fragmented world becomes so difficult. Yes, Reform are the party that at the moment would take most seats off you. But in much the same way that you took seats off the Tories because Reform took votes off them, it's also the case now that in many constituencies, Reform will take seats off you, yes, because they've taken some votes off you, but also because they're taking, because you are losing votes to the Liberal Democrats and the Greens. And you've actually therefore got to come up with a strategy that enables you to deal with the fact that basically the coalition that you had back in 2024 has fragmented in a variety of directions. By the way, it's still the Conservatives who are primarily feeding the Reform juggernaut. Over 1 in 3 of those people who voted Conservative last year have switched to Reform, on top of the 25% who switched in last year's election. And so one of the things you've got to think about when you're attacking Reform is, are we at risk of simply persuading them, even if we succeed, in going back to the Tories? Because there aren't that very many of them who are ex-Labour voters, and I'll show you later on, they have a very, very distinct characteristic. Now, here we go. Here's the data on where the Reform vote is coming from. Okay, now this is the other crucial thing you need to understand about where we are. I know a lot of politicians, including lots of politicians in this party, would like to think that Brexit is over. No. I've already shown you how actually it still was structuring the vote in 2024. It's structuring it even more now. And in a sense, if there's one statistic that you should take out of this room, it is this. 55% of the people who voted Leave in 2016 are currently supporters of Reform. I've already shown you how Reform partly fragmented the Johnsonian coalition last year. They have now destroyed it. And that is the fundamental thing that's happened. Now, in contrast, amongst people who voted Remain, it's only 9%. Now, the point about Brexit is it isn't just about people voting about Brexit. The point is that because, as I said, Brexit is an issue that distinguishes social conservatives versus social liberals. It helps you to understand why those Reform constant messages of, yes, immigration, but also attacks on equalities policies, saying we should stand up for Britain's interests, we shouldn't be apologising for our imperial past and about slavery. Oh, and by the way, we are critical about net zero. It's that collection of policies that people who voted for Leave tend to be in favour of. And it's therefore, it's that second ideological dimension that Reform are now essentially primarily recruiting from. Yes, you're losing votes in both directions, both amongst Remain voters and amongst Leave voters. But you need to understand, Reform, yes, as I'm going to show you in a moment, is profiting from people's adverse perceptions of how this government is handling things. But it is also a very distinct ideological section of our society. It's a very clear niche market. But the point is, a niche market which gets you 30% of the vote under our electoral system at the moment is potentially winning. Indeed, you can actually see the implications of this if you actually look, break down the switching away from Labour last year according to people's current attitudes towards Brexit. So the blue bar shows you how your vote has disappeared, or 2024 vote has disappeared amongst those people who want to be inside the EU. And the red bar shows you the people who have switched amongst those who are in favour of Brexit. The people you have lost to Reform are overwhelmingly Brexiteers. The people you've lost on the Remain side are the ones who've been going to the Greens and Liberal Democrats. So there's a very clear ideological division in terms of the pattern of your party's loss of support. So again, it underlines the fact that you can't just focus on Reform if you're going to recover from the situation you are in. Okay, so this government came into office saying we're going to deliver economic growth, that's the way we'll turn around the fiscal crisis. Are the public convinced so far? No. Not even those people who voted Labour last year are convinced. 63% think the government is handling the economy badly. But does this matter? Now, this is the most difficult part of the presentation this morning. This is where you need to fasten your seatbelt, and I just do need to talk you through this. Once you've got one of these, you will get the rest of it. So what I'm doing here, I'm taking 2024 Labour voters. I am dividing them up into 4 groups. Those people who think the economy is getting a lot worse, that's the blue bar. Those who think it's getting a little worse, the red bar. Staying the same, the grey bar. And the yellow bar are those who think it's getting better. Okay. Now what I'm trying to do here is to find out, well actually, does it make a difference to your probability of saying you will vote Conservative again? Does that vary according to your impression of how the economy is doing? And this is data from the British Election Study from May. It's a big academic study which makes it possible to do this much finer grain analysis. So crucial point number 1, yes, the economy matters. Amongst those 2024 Labour voters who think that the economy is getting a lot worse, only 1 in 4 are willing to vote Labour again. In contrast, amongst those who think it's getting better, then 75% chance of saying you'll vote Labour again. And the don't knows, by the way, are in the denominator here. The trouble is that over half of Labour voters, even in this survey, are in the first 2 left-hand histograms. But the crucial point, therefore, the economy does matter. Where are they going? Well, they're going to the Liberal Democrats and the Greens and to Reform. So again, we need to understand the loss of support for Reform isn't just to do with immigration. These are also some of the folk who are unhappy about the state of the economy. But of course, there's a question of whether or not they go to Reform or whether they go to the Liberal Democrats or the Greens. But the point is, they're going in both directions. We can do the same analysis for the NHS. Here, perceptions have plateaued, but they've plateaued with around 70% of people still thinking the government isn't handling the NHS very well. And amongst 2024 Labour voters, 57% think the government is doing bad. It's not really a subject of much dispute. Pretty much everybody thinks the government is handling these issues badly. We can do the same analysis that I did previously. So the blue bar, 2024 Labour voters who think the NHS is getting a lot worse, nearly 1 in 4 of 2024 Labour voters. The yellow bar, conversely, those who think it's getting better. And as you can see, the probability that you are willing to vote Labour again is greater if you think the NHS is fine, and conversely, it is lower if you think it is worse. So perceptions of the NHS also matter, and yes, again, This is one of the impetuses for people switching to reform. They also switch to Democrats and Greens. The point is, dissatisfaction might push people in either directions, but as I've already shown you, which direction they choose may then depend on other considerations, such as their attitudes towards Brexit and their social conservatism. Let's now do the same thing on immigration. This may surprise you. I'm afraid it was also true of the last Conservative government as well. So, yeah, people have become unhappy about immigration. They've always been relatively unhappy. But again, you can see how more recently, over the summer, the perception of the government's handling immigration well has gone up further. And 68% of Labour voters think it's been handled badly. But how far does this issue, or perceptions of this issue, make a difference to people's willingness to vote Labour again? Now, I should say it does make some difference. Those people who think that immigration is a lot higher, only around a quarter, and voted Labour last time, only around a quarter of them are willing to vote Labour again. But you'll then notice that thereafter, it doesn't make that much difference. And the same was true of the Tories. The Tories focused on immigration, and what they did was to focus on a policy failure rather than the issue that was actually driving voters away from them. Now, what you can see, and again, this helps you to understand the story about reform, the issue matters because the folk who are unhappy about immigration will go to reform, and they won't go through the Democrats and the Greens. So immigration is an issue that, in a sense, its importance lies primarily in determining the destination that people go to if they're unhappy, but their unhappiness may not simply, and almost undoubtedly isn't just to do with immigration. It's also to do with NHS and also to deal with the economy. So you have to deal with that complex of issues, and exactly the same was true of the Conservatives. Immigration didn't really determine whether people defected from the Conservatives in 2024, it determined who they defected to. Meanwhile, coming back to leadership, the truth is there was a very, very brief honeymoon. Immediately after his victory, when Sir Keir Starmer was getting reasonably good favourability ratings, they're now running at below -40, and indeed Ipsos over the weekend, who have got data all the way back to 1977, say that Keir Starmer is now the most unpopular Prime Minister in polling history. In part, of course, that's a product of the fact that in our fragmented politics, we don't have any popular leaders after all. Not even Nigel Farage, who is the least unpopular by politicians, is particularly popular. It becomes much more difficult. But still, you can again see how, even as compared with his party, Sir Keir Starmer is finding life rather more difficult. Equally, and in a sense this perhaps is really surprising, I said earlier, before the election, voters didn't know what Starmer stood for. They're even less likely to do so 12, 15 months into his premiership. And again, new data from Ipsos coming out over the weekend, actually the proportion who now think they're clear what he stands for is down to 35%, down a little bit more. So, as it were, the mystery of Keir Starmer. Who is he? What does he stand for? That mystery, we're now maybe 2/3 of the way through the novel, but we're still not sure where the body lies. Equally, YouGov then asking about Labour in general. They were finding at least a sense before the general election that after the general election that Labour did have a clear sense of purpose. But as you can see, gradually over time now, equally YouGov also pick up the same message. Voters are less clear what this party stands for than they were at the time of the general election. I'm just going to leave that slide up there. I am not going to say anything about it. This is just based on the people who voted Labour back in 2024. So, to conclude, I'll let you draw your own conclusions. I think the crucial point to understand, therefore, this is not just a product of a difficult 15 months in government, a difficulty that is not simply of the party's own making. It is in part a product of political weaknesses and failures to achieve various possible electoral objectives in the run-up to the 2024 election. But my view was there was always going to be a question, given the fact that Labour support was so low and so thin, and given that the reputation of the Conservatives for competent government had been completely shredded by the 2019 to 2024 Parliament, where would voters go if this government was thought not to be performing well? Well, we know the answer, heavily to reform, but also to some degree to the Liberal Democrats and the Greens as well. That was always a question hanging over. And certainly in the wake of that, you need to understand that no previous newly elected government has ever suffered so substantial a fall so early in its office. Yes, why has it lost support? Well, it is because of the difficulty, the fundamental difficulties involved in dealing with the challenges that the government faced, but it's the economy and the NHS that are probably the crucial issues and more important than immigration. But beyond that, it's also a government that lacks a sense of direction in the eyes of the voters. But how you get out of this, well, it isn't just a question of bringing down Nigel Farage, and that's why it's so much more difficult. Yes, reform are your principal threat in terms of seats, but they're far from being the only threat to your ability to persuade 2024 Labour voters to vote for you again in an election which at least is hopefully probably still another 4 years away.
Thank you so much for that. Really comprehensive, very sobering, I imagine, for this audience. Just to be absolutely clear, who is the principal opposition at the moment? Reform or this kind of coalition of Lib Dems and Greens?
Well, I mean, it's clear in terms of where this party is losing support to. It has to worry about all of them, all of the above. Okay. I think there are two reasons as to why the party is framing things as they are. So let's play devil's advocate for a moment. The first is that it is reform that are the principal challenge in terms of seats. So although I've kind of said you don't want to put people back in the hands of the Tories, to be honest, if all that Labour managed to achieve in the next few weeks was to persuade some people to vote Tory rather than reform, they'd probably not be entirely unhappy, because in terms of seats, that would improve Labour's prospects. So you can see why they might want to focus. The second reason, however, is in a sense it's part of the old two-party playbook, which is we're going to identify the enemy. And we're going to say to people, we are the only people who stand between you and the enemy. So therefore you have to vote for us. And I think part of the hope is that by saying the principal thing is you need to stop reform, and we, by the way, are the best people best placed to deal with it, you will then persuade people not to vote for the Democrats and the Greens. Now, this is classic two-party politics. So historically you said, you don't want a Tory government, so therefore you need to vote for us. Well, at this point, I'm just going to gently remind you, how did the Conservatives start the 2024 election campaign? They said, you mustn't vote reform because it will let Starmer in. What do the polling say about the active reform voters? We don't care. So the point is that tactic doesn't always work. And the truth is that at the moment, again, polling up for Ipsos, yeah, sure, Liberal Democrats and Green voters don't want reform. Tories would prefer reform to Labour. So the extent to therefore actually this tactic, whether or not the old trick of two-party politics will work in a fragmented world of five-party politics, we can question.
And I know that below all of this, there's so much more data in real time. Is there any glimmer of hope? Like, over the last year, has anything worked for Labour?
Not obvious, is it? No. I mean, I think the honest answer to that question is no. I mean, I think, but what I would then go on to say, slightly more optimistic, is that clearly one of the implications of what I'm saying is that while, in particular, I don't think reform will disappear, because there are two firmly embedded in a certain ideological section of our society, It's an ideological section of our society which frankly is largely beyond the reach of this party. It might be within the reach of the Conservatives, but they are at the moment are struggling to deal with it. So I don't think they're going to disappear. But that said, clearly if by 2029 the economy is turned around, and if by 2029 the waiting lists are way, way back down, and either immigrate, I mean, in a sense, the crucial thing about immigration is you need to have a rather closer relationship between the rhetoric of immigration and the reality. And the problem for all governments, really ever since 2005, is that there's been a disjuncture between the two, usually in the direction of being more liberal than they were letting on, including not least Boris Johnson. That needs to be brought in line. Thereafter, frankly, my view is don't repeat the Tories' mistake and focus on an issue where at the end of the day, you don't have complete control. Until the world is a much safer place in more countries, we are still going to find people trying to cross the channel, unless, of course, we find it easier for them, make it easier for them to claim asylum before they get here. But that, you know, this is where we get into the whole debate about immigration. But to be honest, I think the Tories made a mistake focusing on immigration. I think certainly there is clear polling evidence that Reform may have overreached themselves when they have moved into the territory of saying those people already have the right to indefinite leave to stay here. That should be questioned. And the polling evidence suggests that may be a step too far for voters. But beyond that, actually immigration as opposed to the status of people already here, I would stop shouting about it.
Now, I see you give these talks at Lib Dems and at Conservatives as well, and they really are as tough as this in their own way.
And you can imagine what the news is going to be the Tories next week.
If we did this at a Reform Party conference, what would be your toughest messages for Reform?
I think my toughest message to Reform would be is that while you have corralled socially conservative Britain, there clearly is something that's missing about the appeal of reform as compared with the appeal of Trump and the appeal of many of the populist right parties in what we used to call Western Europe. And that is that they're not really tapping into the economic dissatisfaction that tends to be quite highly prevalent amongst younger voters, given in the post-financial crash world. It is much more, there are question marks about the extent to which the next generation is going to be better off than their parents' generation. We see some of that in this country in terms of some of the labour market difficulties amongst young middle-class professionals. But Reform haven't as yet crafted the kind of economic message that, I mean, they're not going to win over younger voters on social conservatives because younger voters are socially liberal. It's a question whether they can also tap much more clearly into the very substantial economic dissatisfaction in this country in the way that they so far haven't done. So they're all very much about cultural wars issues, as I've said. The question is, can they actually begin to occupy a space in the left-right divide? And that, I don't think they've done.
Brilliant. Right, we're going to take some questions from the floor. We've got some mics. I'm going to go to the gentleman at the front here and the gentleman behind him there first, and then we'll take another round. Are there mics coming round, or? Let's go for it. So, can you give your name first, please?
Yes, so hi.
Yes.
Okay.
Turn it over there. And sorry, the mics don't help you in the room. They're for the YouTube audience.
That's quite right. So it's Daniel Green from Labour List. Thank you very much, Sir John. Obviously, you mentioned that it's 4 years out to a general election, but of course, the sentiment among the public can stick if they've got a dissatisfaction with the government. So I guess my question is this recoverable for Labour? And if it is it more about delivery or is it a change at the top needed? Thank you.
Well, let me say two things. One thing, first of all, which is that one of the lessons of the last Parliament is don't attempt to forecast the outcome of the election on the basis of where you are 12 months in. You know, for the first 2 years of the last Parliament, the Conservatives were never consistently behind Labour in the polls. Along came Partygate and the rest is history. Okay, so I mean, point one. Point two, again, I think one has to acknowledge here, we are in uncharted territory, right? We have never previously had this kind of five-party politics, and again, it's difficult. But I've already indicated, I think clearly if the public feel, I mean, you are talking about a deeply, deeply pessimistic electorate. And again, it predates 2024. I mean, during the last Parliament, the levels of economic optimism registered by Ipsos, you never had seen people so pessimistic, so consistently over the period of a Parliament. Of course, it was a Parliament where living standards basically didn't improve. We are talking about a public, record levels of dissatisfaction. So the public are really concerned about the state of the country. Okay, but if you can turn that around, then maybe you will. Now, obvious questions we have in mind. Some of us, I will tell you now, are of the view that this party made a mistake in making some of the promises it made about taxation before the general election, because it just, you already got very severe fiscal constraint, and you then just reduce the firepower of the state even more, and getting the health service, I think it was clearly hoping it would get out of the fiscal bind sooner rather than later. Through economic growth, it proves to be much more difficult. It may well be that in 10 years' time, when all this infrastructure this government is planning is there, we'll go, wasn't it a brilliant government? But infrastructure does take a long time to come through. So, one can raise all the doubts about whether it's achievable, but still, you might be able to turn the mood of the country around. But if you're going to turn the mood of the country around, you need to do more than change the reality. You also have to influence perception. And clearly the question that is being raised about the current Labour leadership is, does it have the ability to change the mood? Because that is to do with political leadership. It isn't just to do with technical delivery. I'll go as far as that, but no further.
Thank you. Gentleman behind you.
Thank you. My name is Michael Ward from the Arundel and South Downs Labour Party. I want to ask John about what he called the old two-party playbook. It seems to me, since the end of the First World War, Labour has enjoyed a certain advantage as being one of the two parties in a binary system. We've held the leadership of the opposition for most of that time, lead on Prime Minister's questions, you have a right to reply to ministerial broadcast, and the whole thing is presented as a binary divide, and you can run on the appeal that the pigs in Animal Farm have. Whenever there's a threat, you say, but you wouldn't want Jones back, would you? Yep. And it's like that. And it seems to me that there must be a tipping point. And you ride out the odd moment when your polling support goes below 30%, because you know the reward is that now and then you'll get a high poll, you'll have 5 years of power. Is there a tipping point where a party's support dwindles below the 30s into the 20s, and instead of electoral reform being an abstract debate, it's an absolute necessity for the party? And can we recognise that tipping point in time?
Well, what is certainly true is that a party, some Labour MPs did say to me after the last election, well, the great thing about the electoral system is that it kept reform out. And I said, well, it hasn't entirely succeeded. And the truth is, and you only need to know your Scottish electoral history to know these brutal facts. A party with a geographically evenly spread vote at 15% and running third is going to come away with very little. A party with a geographically evenly spread vote that is something like 10 points ahead of everybody else in a fragmented environment, it might only have 30% of the vote, but it goes walkies. Okay, because that geographically evenly spread vote and the big lead you have becomes your advantage. And I think, whatever your views about the electoral system, the crucial lesson of 2024 is that the operation of first past the post depends crucially on geography. And we can debate whether or not geography should matter as much as it should. I certainly in other audiences have been asked the question, well, what about electoral reform? My answer to you is that President Mitterrand in the 1980s did see the writing on the wall. He concluded that his Socialist Party was going to lose the parliamentary election in 1986, and he wanted at least to create a parliament that was hung, as opposed to one where the right would clearly have a majority. So he changed the electoral system. Trouble is, it's very difficult to persuade politicians to read the writing on the wall until after the writing, the prophecy has taken place. So whether or not, if this continues, whether or not this party, which of course has voted in favour of changing the electoral system, and by the way, British Social Attitudes data shows that a majority of supporters of all parties are now in favour of changing the voting system. It's a very, very substantial change, but I'm somehow doubtful that 400 Labour MPs currently profiting from the current system. You always want to hope that something will happen. So I mean, at the point where, beyond that, I would say at the moment I would worry in terms of have we reached a fundamental change. I mean, I think one of the questions that we're clearly asking ourselves as well: are we in the longer run talking about a fragmentation of our party politics, or are we talking about the replacement of the Conservatives by reform? I mean, in the case of the Conservatives, the problem is clear. They have lost more than half of their 2019 voters to reform. They have lost large numbers of activists. The majority of the people who were elected as reform councillors are former Conservative activists. They're beginning to lose MSPs, MSs, even one MP, plenty of ex-MPs, and the financial lifeblood is being sucked out of the Conservative Party as well. You're not yet as a party in that situation, and to that extent at least, one might want to argue that your chances of recovery, which isn't just a question of polling numbers, but also to do with your ability to maintain the party as an organisation and to continue to raise money, etc., etc. And I don't think your position at the moment is yet serious. And the point is, you were at 21% in May 2019, which is why we can debate whether or not this or isn't worth the call. I mean, the Conservatives weren't an awful lot better than that back in the middle of 2019, but along came Boris Johnson, and the rest is history. So things can change sometimes quite quickly. So yes, you can think about whether or not you should be changing the electoral system, question mark. It's certainly true that at the moment, the only reason why reform have a chance of an overall majority is because of the electoral system. But that said, I guess even if you were minded to want to play that game, you probably would want to stay your hand for at least a couple of years before you saw you really were in as much trouble as you might think you are.
Next questions. There's a hand there, Snare. And then straight after that we'll go to this lady in front.
Hey, sorry, I'm Jenny Holmes, just a member of Wirral Party.
There's no Juster.
Sorry. I just wondered if, did the public take any notice of Starmer's performance in the international stage, which seems to be largely seen as very positive amongst the world?
Yeah, I always think one of the ironies about Keir Starmer, he's very good at bad news. He handles it extremely well. And certainly if you look in terms of his personal ratings, they did improve a bit in the wake of the intervention about defence, etc., etc. And equally, they have now gone down. I mean, insofar as Rayner and Mandelson matters, it's affecting Starmer personally, as opposed to the party more broadly. So yes, to some degree. And but the problem is that I think one could reasonably argue at that point he sounded prime ministerial. He was saying, this is what we need to do as a country. This is the direction in which we're going, and it was very crystal clear. I think his problem is he's not very good at optimism. Right? I mean, the government started off with all this, the Tories have left us this terrible mess. It really is a big challenge, etc., etc. Now, in a sense, he's being honest because he's right. It is difficult, but it isn't necessarily the best of politics. Or at least you've got to measure that with an idea of where it is you're trying to take people. I mean, one of the ways in which I characterise this, I'm probably now getting to be really unpopular with this audience, but one of the ways I characterise this sometimes is, in a sense, what Keir Starmer did last year was say, hello, I'm your nice, friendly local plumber. I believe you've got quite a lot of leaks in your policy pipes. So I'm going to come along and bung them up for you, solve them, right? Well, of course, 15 months on, it's still a bit damp around here. Not quite sure where all these leaks are coming from. But the problem is that in the end, the public aren't looking to politicians to be their local friendly plumber. They're actually looking to their politicians to be the architect of Valhalla. They want a new house, not the old house repaired. And it's the sense of, what does the new house that this country would occupy look like after another 4 years of Labour government? So we've talked about, right, yes, we might be able to deal with the policy problems, but then you've got to move beyond that to be able to say, and this is the bright new Britain that this party wants to create. And the truth is, you may not think it's a bright new Britain, but some people do. People are very clear what Farage stands for. And that gives them a very clear point of reference that they then react to.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm coming to you because we had a quick chat before, and you are one of 2 Labour councillors in Kent County Council.
Kent County Council, Reform Run,
So
absolutely.
front line of this, what's your question?
Well, my question when I was standing in the queue was, do you think that Nigel Farage should stop living rent-free in Keir Starmer's head? But I think you've answered that. So just to twist it slightly, what do you think should be in Keir Starmer's head?
I think I've already been given an indication, which is that basically what should be his head, or rather what should come out of his head and out of his mouth, is his vision of what this country, what kind of country he wants to create. What is he trying to achieve? What are the things that he would like to achieve, as opposed to the things that he feels the last government got wrong, that he wants to fix? And it's going from one to the other. And you know, we're still hearing Labour ministers say, well, you know, it was the mess from the last lot. Well, you aren't going to be able to do that for much longer, because it's soon going to be your mess. I think now, interestingly, I heard the Chancellor this morning, I think now she's going to blame a mixture of Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin for having to increase taxes. So we've kind of got a new set of people. Again, there's a certain amount of validity to our argument. But at some point, you've got to move forward to, this is what we own. This is ours. Not, okay, here's a sticking plaster.
We have time for 2 more questions, but Sir John will be hanging around for some time afterwards, so there's lots of time for one-to-ones with the Professor. There we go, at the back.
Back to your point about the Tories at the last election said, if you vote Reform, you'll get Starmer.
Yeah.
And you said they didn't care.
Yeah.
Now, I think there would be a difference of people who have swung to the Lib Dems and Greens.
Yeah.
If it was a choice between Labour and Reform, their hatred of Reform might well, they will care. They will not want to see a Reform government. There is more likelihood that they will tactically vote Labour in order to keep Reform out. And I don't mean just voting Labour. In the Caerphilly by-election at the moment, the anti-Reform votes are going behind Plaid Cymru in order to try and stop Reform. In local council elections, we've seen a collapse in the vote of the Green vote, who have swung behind Plaid, who are seen as an acceptable vehicle in order to stop Reform.
I've already acknowledged your point. You know, this is possible, right? But it will depend on. But point one is, as I said, but equally you can drive Tories into the hand of Reform because they prefer Reform to Labour, right? Yeah. And secondly, it will also depend on how people feel about a Labour government. You know, a Labour government that is deemed to have failed by 2029, it's no good saying it's us or Reform, because people will say, well, frankly, you made a mess up. Let's go for Reform. And that was the problem for the Tories. The Tories were deemed to have failed, and therefore the threat of Labour wasn't a threat because even Labour was perhaps better than the current Conservative government. So again, this is why your ability to be able to improve the record and image of this government in the eyes of the public is so crucial.
Brilliant. And our colleague right at the back there, with the microphone on his right shoulder.
Thank you. Building on that point, I want to say, isn't there an element of kind of de-risking as well? Because in 2024, even though the Labour vote didn't go up, there was some speculation that Keir Starmer, kind of by changing the Labour Party compared to Corbyn, even if the Labour vote didn't go up, it didn't drive people to Conservatives, it made the Reform people feel safer, it made the Tories less able to neutralise the Lib Dems with that sort of Lib Dem Tory flirty bit of the vote. Doesn't that mean Farage needs to do something to de-risk himself in order to be less of a threat to that and to sort of break up the Labour coalition more?
I enjoyed your revisionist version of Starmer's electoral success. That's my answer.
Okay. What's your final message for this audience? Your key message? What does Labour need to do?
Labour needs to tell the country what it stands for, what it believes in, and also then be able to link that to how it's going to get there. So in a sense, the crucial point therefore is, rather than saying by doing this to the economy we are going to fix the problems of the Tories, what you have to be able to do is say is that by fixing the economy, this is the vision of the future that we will deliver. So the crucial synoptic art of politics is the ability to articulate a synoptic vision which is then illustrated through particular policy proposals. The fascinating thing about where we're at, Starmer so far hasn't been able to do it. Sunak couldn't do it. Badenoch hasn't done it yet. Davey can't do it. Farage can do it, and maybe Polanski can as well. And I think you should be aware that Polanski, certainly in terms of his ability to speak and to convey messages, looks like a potentially important development. Question mark.
Brilliant. I want to say a huge thank you to you, huge thank you to the audience.